All right, welcome everyone, and welcome to our event titled Ending the Forever War, President Biden's Decision to Withdraw U.S. Troops from Afghanistan. I'm Eli Clifton. I'm a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And this panel is a natural topic for the Quincy Institute. If you're not familiar with our work, our mission is to promote ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy in pursuit of international peace. This effort is really exemplified by our research fellow, Adam Weinstein, who has done fantastic work analyzing US policy options in Afghanistan that simultaneously accept the necessity of a troop withdrawal, but also recognize the importance of remaining engaged diplomatically. He will be moderating our panel today. Over to you, Adam, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. We have a great lineup today. And first, let me introduce Ambassador Olson. And in addition to several other postings around the world, Ambassador Richard Olson served as U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan from 2012 to 2015, and U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, also known as the SRAP, from 2015 to 16. And he also served as the Coordinating Director for Development and Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, from 2011 to 2012. Next, we have Dr. Vanda Felbaugh-Brown. And Dr. Felbaugh-Brown is a senior fellow at the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She's also the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors and co-director of the Africa Security Initiative. And she served as a senior advisor to the congressionally mandated Afghanistan study group. And she's traveled extensively in Afghanistan for field work as well as all around the world. And lastly, we have Dr. Jonathan Schroden. He is the director of the Center for Naval Analyses Countering Threats and Challenges program. And that mission is to support U.S. Government efforts to understand and counter state and non-state actors. He's deployed to Afghanistan or traveled to Afghanistan 13 times to advise senior commanders. And he also served as a senior advisor to the Afghanistan study group. So we're going to get right into it. And I want to start with Vanda. Vanda, on Twitter, you referred to the decision to President Biden's decision to withdraw the remaining troops as quote, absolutely right. You described it as, quote, the right strategic choice. You also acknowledged it was a heavy moment for Afghans. And in an article for Brookings, a blog post for Brookings, actually, you wrote, quote, the US military presence has slowed the Taliban militarily and political gains, but not reverse them, even when American troop levels were 100,000 strong. And you also wrote, it has no prospect of accomplishing them with 5,000 or 10,000 troops staying for another 5 or 10 years, let alone less. In fact, you've described the US policy in Afghanistan or the US strategy in Afghanistan since 2015 as staying and praying. And you actually made some of these points back in 2016 in a long form brief that is titled Blood and Faith in Afghanistan, for any viewers that want to Google that and go into a deep dive of some of these factors that existed back in 2016. And I think that paper actually, a lot of the points you made turned out to be true. So can you unpack this assessment a little bit for us?
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for welcoming me to the discussion. And it's absolutely great to be enjoying this conversation also with Ambassador Olson and Dr. Schroden. I should start by saying that I only speak for myself. Brookings has no institutional view, and I also don't represent in any way in my comments the views of the Afghanistan study group that you mentioned. I long supported the US involvement in Afghanistan and argued that governance had to be centerpiece of it and that state building was an appropriate element of the effort. Nonetheless, several years ago, I have reached the conclusion that our policy, our strategy was merely that of staying and praying. Namely, the assumption was that as long as we continue propping up the government in Kabul, the so-called Afghan Republic, as it is referred to now, and the Afghan security forces, we can slow down the rate of the Taliban's gains And the hope was that at some point the Taliban would make enough mistakes to start committing enough strategic errors on the battlefield and do itself from within. That strategy has not panned out. The Taliban has not made those strategic mistakes. So why is it time to go now? Well, first, we have accomplished the counterterrorism objective of severely degrading Al-Qaeda. In fact, we had accomplished that objective about 10 years ago. Since then, the issue was whether our withdrawal would leave behind essentially the current political dispensation, the democratic arrangements and the legal rights that were obtained along with the economic development. The prospect looks very bleak, and in my view, this is not going to be accomplished. But as I mentioned, our military presence is at this point only slowing down the rate of Taliban's effectiveness. If we maintained forces in Afghanistan beyond the May 1st deadline, now the September 11th deadline, with an open-ended commitment, we would be back in a fighting war with the Taliban without any prospect of ending the fighting war any better than we have now. Two other reasons, and I'll end with that, why I think that it was a strategic decision. Compared to 2015, compared to a decade ago, the opportunity cost, the strategic costs of our continued military presence are very different. President Biden is absolutely right to say that the strategic priority should be focused on China, Russia. He's also absolutely right that the terrorism threat has devolved and diffused, and it's no longer the case that it is any more severe from Afghanistan than it is from other places. Arguably, it is more severe from other places. Plus, one consequence of these difficult wars is the domestic terrorism element that is linked to veterans that struggle to integrate well back into life in the US and the civilian life, and that have been key actors in the various right-wing armed groups that we are seeing. Finally, and this is my final comment, the hallmark of a wise power is the capacity to prioritize. It is to make decisions that when we are putting money in something that's no longer generating adequate returns, we will take the money away, the resources away, and put them to issue areas where more important strategic progress can be made, such as pandemic, such as halting the devastating environmental degradation, climate issues.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I want to get back to this idea of cost for a moment, because some of the advocates for remaining in Afghanistan militarily have said, well, we just have 2,500 to 3,500 troops in the country. So why not just keep those troop levels in country for the foreseeable future until we might reach a peace agreement? And Ambassador Olson, I wanted to direct this question to you. I think you've mentioned before that without a peace deal, a permanent presence in Afghanistan, at least a permanent military presence in Afghanistan, would entail going back up to pre-February 2020 levels, and that this notion that we could just keep 2,500 troops and maintain the status quo is not realistic. Could you talk about that a little bit more and why you come to that assessment?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for including me in the panel today. The basic point is, I think that it has not been really covered adequately in the public discussion, especially by, as you say, those who would advocate for keeping a residual presence in Afghanistan. The fact is that since the February agreement, the February of last year, the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, we have in effect had what almost amounts to a separate peace with the Taliban. And the result of that is there have been actually 0 US fatalities during the course of the last year. And it has allowed the Trump era drawdowns from somewhere around 12,000, I think, all the way down to 2,500 or slightly more. And the idea that this would continue after the May 1st deadline that was written into the agreement, the Doha Agreement, I think is very difficult to understand. I mean, we committed to, in the Doha Agreement, to completely withdraw US forces by May 1st of this year. If we had chosen to remain, the Taliban I think, would have regarded this as breaking the agreement. I mean, you note that even now, they are making noises about the fact that even though we plan to withdraw by September 11th, they regard that as in some sense an infringement of the Doha Agreement. I think they would have come back with full force against the US. And so the idea that we could simply maintain the status quo of 2,500 troops, I think, is unrealistic. I'm not a military planner. I don't know what the right number is, but I think we drew down from around 8,500. That would be about the minimum I think we could expect. And that would be necessary to hold out against a full-on Taliban offensive, and it might actually be considerably more. I think from a political perspective, what that would have meant for the Biden administration was owning not just the ongoing war in Afghanistan, but to some extent an escalation over the status quo, and of course the attendant casualties. And I think that was an important factor in President Biden's decision, and it's why he said at several points in the announcement that the maintenance of the status quo is impossible.
Okay, thanks for that answer. I want to turn it over to Jonathan. And you were also an advisor to this congressionally mandated Afghanistan study group. And I think it's important for the audience to understand that the official conclusions of this report are not necessarily those of the senior advisors. They advised, but their conclusions might have been different. And you were a very vocal critic on social media and in your writing of the official recommendations of the Afghanistan study group that we should just remain in Afghanistan and transition to a conditions-based withdrawal. And actually, you wrote on Twitter that remaining unilaterally in Afghanistan, and I quote, guaranteed war for as long as the US stayed, and that, quote, pundits arguing that the US should stay to bring about conditions for peace ignore the Taliban's stance on this. And Vanda, you actually made a similar point in your Brookings piece when you wrote, there is no credible path whereby a sustained US troop presence helps bring a desirable peace deal. And you used Colombia as an example for that. So Dr. Schroden, I mean, could you explain why you think staying in Afghanistan unilaterally would guarantee the continuation of this war? And I think we understand that leaving and withdrawing US troops does not mean the war will end. It's ending the US military role in the war. It's not ending the war for Afghans. But can you explain how you came to this conclusion that remaining militarily in Afghanistan would lead to an indefinite prolonging of the war?
Yeah, no, well, let me start by thanking you for the opportunity to join today. It's an honor to be here with Vanda and Ambassador Olson as well. And as Vanda said, similar caveats apply right to my comments. So let me start with that. Yeah, I mean, I probably used a bit stronger language on Twitter than I might have if I were writing an analytic paper, right? Words like guaranteed are of course, no one can guarantee anything, but making an assessment with high confidence is probably a way that I would have written that analytically. But the point being that, there are certain trend lines that one can draw analytically. And when you think about the possibility, or when I thought about the possibility of the US staying militarily at 2,500, 5,000, right, some smallish number of troops, I came to a similar conclusion as my CNA colleague Carter Malkasian, who wrote in a foreign affairs article that the US military had become a driver of the conflict over time. That our presence there was, in my view, preventing the ultimate, reconciliation or reckoning, if it comes to that, between Afghans themselves, right? That this is at its heart disagreements among Afghans as to what the future structure of their government should be, what the future trajectory of their country should be, and we were standing in the way of that, that reconciliation or that reckoning, if it comes to that, actually happening. And we were doing so for, I think, as Vanda described, questionable goals at this point with respect to counterterrorism interests and those types of things. And so my view was that there are costs, right? A lot of the arguments that were being made to stay were cost benefit arguments. The idea that the US had only, had gotten down to a couple thousand troops. We hadn't suffered any casualties in a year. The somewhat offensive argument that, the $30 billion or so per year that the war was costing was, couch change for the Department of Defense. As a taxpayer, I find that somewhat offensive, but nonetheless, right, that it was much less than it had been during the surge, et cetera. And what those arguments would rarely, if ever, mention was the cost in Afghan lives, right? The sheer fact that there have been thousands of dead Afghans year in and year out for the last 5 years at least, I just saw no relief from that by continuing to stay in country. Now, it is entirely possible that things will get worse when we leave. I acknowledge that might happen. But it is also, there are arguments that could be made to suggest that a full-blown, massive civil war will not actually unfold, right? And we don't know what that future is. But it seemed pretty likely. I think you could assess with very high confidence again, that had we stayed, we would continue to see thousands of dead Afghans year in and year out for questionable return on those costs.
Well, so this is a question I kind of want to open up to anyone on the panel that wants to answer first, which is you sometimes hear folks, and there's a question like this in the Q&A right now, say, well, we have a moral obligation to stay militarily involved in Afghanistan. Do you think that is an argument that carries weight? I'll open it up to anyone.
Well, perhaps I can start by saying that I don't believe that is the case. I think we have a moral obligation to continue mitigating negative outcomes in Afghanistan and stay engaged to mitigate those negative outcomes. But it is absolutely appropriate that we set limits on what means we engage in that, and we balance this moral obligation, real as it is, to moral obligation to our citizens and to our commitment to advance the interest of the United States on issues that particularly matter. And that means the capacity to prioritize objectives and the capacity to prioritize the means that we devote to particular objectives. So the decision to withdraw militarily, in my view, is absolutely right, including from a moral perspective. I believe that the prospects for Afghanistan are bleak, that the existing social political order will not stay, that it will become more authoritarian, less respectful of rights, even on paper, let alone in execution, that there will be cost to human rights, civil rights, women's rights. Hopefully, eventually there will be peace, but in my view, there will be at minimum months of fighting before we get to even serious prospect for negotiations. None of that obviates, though, that our foreign policy needs to be centered on what advances the interest and well-being of US citizens and prioritize means and objectives.
Can I comment on this?
Sure, I was going to go to you next since you've represented the United States around the world.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, I have to say, in Washington, when you're on a panel, you're not really supposed to say this, but I do feel a sense of profound ambivalence about the decision. I think, as Vanda has said, I think strategically, it is probably the right decision. And I would say beyond that, I think it was the inevitable decision. I think I have felt for some time that it was inevitable that the United States would, in fact, find it necessary to withdraw its forces because of larger strategic considerations. And so therefore, this is a question of timing in some sense. And you can, one can be critical or not of the actual timing of the decision. But I do think, I agree with Vanda that it's imperative that the US not take this opportunity provided by troop withdrawals to completely disengage from the region. And here the lessons of 1989, 1992 are particularly relevant. That is to say, after the Soviet Union ended, and I'm not drawing an analogy between the United States and the Soviet Union, but after the Soviet Union withdrew its forces, it maintained a degree of engagement until the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think that is, it was only once the Soviet Union collapsed that the regime that it had installed in Afghanistan collapsed. I think it is important for us to continue to provide assistance to the Afghan government, both bilaterally and multilaterally, especially through the World Bank that keeps the government funded, and to keep funding the Afghan security forces, especially the Air Force and the commandos. So I think, and most of all, I think it's important for the United States to really push the peace process. I think right now the Doha process or the Istanbul process, whatever you want to call it, is somewhat stalled, and because of Taliban intransigence, and I think it will continue to be stalled until as the Taliban press after U.S. withdrawal against the government. So it may take some time before that process can revive. In the meantime, I think the U.S. has an absolute moral obligation to engage the region and to use its influence with all of the regional states to bring about pressure on the Taliban to reach a political accommodation with their rivals. The temptation for the Taliban right now will be to try, I think, to actually take the whole of Afghanistan militarily. I'm not sure they have the capability to do that. That's not my area of expertise. But we should be encouraging a continued political settlement, and we should use the regional consensus in favor of peace and the expressed desire of the region to not see a return of the 1990s and the emirativeness of the Taliban emirate of Afghanistan. Over.
Okay, so I want to actually get back to your area of expertise, Ambassador, which I don't think there's many people in Washington, D.C. who understand Pakistan better than you. In the Q&A, actually, Dr. Barnett Rubin mentioned a point that he's mentioned many times in public fora, which is that Afghanistan is landlocked, and that to have land or air access to Afghanistan, you have to have cooperation from Pakistan. And we also know that Pakistan has been both a very negative actor and at times a positive actor in Afghanistan. They have prolonged the conflict through their support of the Afghan Taliban, and certainly the Pakistani establishment has some Afghan blood on its hands. But at the same time, Pakistan has been crucial to bringing the Taliban to the negotiating table at times. So given your experience working with the Pakistanis and given the real concerns that Pakistan has in outcomes in Afghanistan, what do you think the prospects are for the United States being able to work with the Pakistanis and ensure that perhaps the Taliban stay somewhat engaged in a diplomatic process and perhaps at least reduce violence a little bit, if not agree to a comprehensive ceasefire?
Yeah, I think Pakistan is very important. But the first thing I would say is I would want to try to cast this in terms of an overall regional diplomacy. And the reason I say that is because the Taliban are more susceptible, of course, to influence and pressure from Pakistan than any other country, but they also do have some other options. They have at various times flirted with the Iranians. They have done tours. Their political commission has been on the road visiting other capitals in the region. So I think at a minimum, you need to bring together Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, and perhaps the northern neighbors of Afghanistan, and forge a regional consensus on not encouraging the Taliban or dissuading the Taliban from attempting a purely military solution to this conflict, which I think will only lead to a prolonged and intensified civil war. So in terms of Pakistan specifically, look, you're absolutely correct that for the past 20 years, I mean, Pakistan has been, on the one hand, helping us because, as Barney correctly points out, you have, if you want to go into Afghanistan, you have to go through Pakistani airspace or Iranian airspace. Those are your basic options. And obviously, Iran is foreclosed for the United States. But at the same time, Pakistan has been sponsoring the Taliban. at least to the extent of allowing the Taliban leadership to enjoy a safe haven on Pakistani territory. Over the past 18 months or so, we have all of a sudden had a greater degree of alignment with Pakistan. And I think it is fundamentally in Pakistan's interest right now to pursue a peace process and to encourage the Taliban to perhaps to get a ceasefire, but certainly to moderate their behavior and to reach accommodation with their rivals. Because otherwise, if Pakistan faces an intensified civil war on its western border, it is likely to see huge refugee flows as it did during the war in the 1970s. And I think Pakistanis are very aware of this. The question is always in Pakistan is who's going to make this decision. And certainly within the ranks of the army and the intelligence services, there are people who remain supporters of the Taliban and are fully prepared to back them and see a Taliban victory as a victory for Pakistan. But I think the broader foreign policy establishment, if you want to call that, and the more thoughtful elements of the military leadership see the dangers to an intensified civil war in Afghanistan and the refugee flows. So I think they need to. I think that Pakistan needs to address these issues, but I think we can help on that by making a very firm position in favor of accommodation.
I don't mean to keep you on the spot, Ambassador, but you said obviously Iran is foreclosed. And I mean, can you comment on what would a more functional U.S.-Iran relationship do? Perhaps if we re-entered the JCPOA, and we had a less dysfunctional relationship with Iran, what impact would that have on the future of Afghanistan and our abilities to help bring about a political solution? And, in that same line of thought, Daniel Markey, I think, had an article in The Hill recently where he talked about how Afghanistan presents a situation, a potential off-ramp for U.S.-China relations, an area where the United States and Beijing can potentially cooperate because China does not want to see a terrorist running around in Afghanistan, and an unstable Afghanistan is not a good thing for China, and China does have some economic interest in Afghanistan. So in terms of our deteriorating relationship with Beijing and our completely dysfunctional relationship with Iran, does Afghanistan present an opportunity, or at least a limited one, to make those relationships a little bit more functional?
Well, yeah, I think that first of all, there's a funny there has been a funny convergence of interest between the United States and Iran with regard to Afghanistan. I mean, it is one of the few places in the world, without getting into a lot of detail, where we actually have had back channel, quiet diplomatic exchanges with the Iranians. And they have by and large expressed broad support for what we have been doing in Afghanistan. They have been supporting broadly the government of Afghanistan. But at the same time, like Pakistan, they have their own version of their establishment. They have the IRGC, which maintains relationships with the Taliban as part of a hedging strategy. And there are certainly people within the IRGC who I think would prefer to see the U.S. go out, with a humiliating defeat. But I think there's an internal debate that has to be taken into account with Iran. But I would fundamentally agree that if we can get the U.S.-Iran relationship to a point where we are actively talking, Afghanistan is one of the areas where there could be potential cooperation, simply because Iran, like all of the neighbors, does not want an intensifying civil war, and more than most, has an interest in preserving the existing order that exists for the last 20 years, not least because most of Iran's co-religionists, the Shia minority in Afghanistan, the Hazara are implacably opposed to the Taliban and would presumably suffer the most under the Taliban. So I think there are a lot of, there's a lot of potential here. Whether we can get past the immediate obstacle of the JCPOA is a real question. I mean, relations with Iran, which were never cordial, but certainly have deteriorated so much over the past 4 years that with the talks that recently took place had to be done on the basis of proximity. That is to say, the Iranian delegation would not meet with the U.S. delegation face to face. They held proximity talks in Europe. So I think, I'm cautiously optimistic that over the medium term, Iran can be a useful diplomatic partner with the United States, but it's only over the medium term I think we have to get through. And to answer your original question, I don't see any prospect of us having use of Iranian airspace to get into Afghanistan in anything like a time frame that would be a useful alternative to what we have now.
Thanks for that answer. I want to get back to the question of terrorism for a moment, because when we cut through a lot of the justifications for staying in Afghanistan, the one that always rises to the top is terrorism, and that we have to stay in Afghanistan because of the terrorist threat. Dr. Schroden, you've described this idea of safe havens for terrorists as a bit of a logical fallacy and a bad way to look at terrorism prevention in general. Can you explain why you think the safe haven framing of Afghanistan and terrorism is not productive in your view?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things about that. I mean, one, the idea of safe haven really it's synonymous with another phrase you'll hear, which is ungoverned space, right? The idea that there are these spaces where terrorists have a free hand to do whatever they want, and that they will use those spaces to then generate capabilities that they'll use to attack the United States or our allies and partners. And undoubtedly, right, it is possible that that could happen, right? That if there is a space in which they are completely untouchable and unaccountable, that they could do that. But there's a certain logic, there's a certain set of assumptions that are baked into that. One is that there is such a thing as ungoverned space, right? That there are these spaces where there is no government reach, there is no even local accountability, and those spaces are extremely rare, right? And a lot of the places in which Al Qaeda operates, for example, are spaces that are neither ungoverned nor outside the reach of accountability to local populations. And so, right, so there's a sort of fallacy at the outset there. There's also this set of assumptions, I think, that a lot of people make, which is, if there's an ungoverned space somewhere and a terrorist group like Al Qaeda is able to set up camp there, that they will necessarily use that space to generate capabilities that would allow them to attack the US. And once they have those capabilities, they would necessarily use them to conduct such an attack. And it almost treats that like an automatic set of steps that unfold regardless of what the terrorist group itself might choose to do or choose not to do, what exogenous factors might weigh upon the terrorist group's decision making and its capabilities, et cetera. So there's this assumption that because of this chain of events, which again are assumed to be guaranteed to happen for the most part, that ergo one cannot allow a terrorist group to have a safe haven anywhere in the world. So, right, not only is the concept flawed, but the chain of events that might flow from it are often assumed to be more or less guaranteed to happen. And I challenge those set of assumptions, right? I just don't think that's a useful framework of thinking about things. And there's also, there's a component of this too, which I discussed in a recent Twitter thread, which is risk, right? The idea of risk. And there's a key question that you see get asked over and over again, and it was asked of the CIA director recently by a member of Congress, which is, if we withdraw from Afghanistan, will the risk of a terrorist attack on the homeland go up, right? And the answer is, of course, yes, right? But that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, by how much will that risk go up? And by how much would we keep that risk reduced if we were to stay? right? That's really the question that needs to be asked. And if you examine it through that lens, which frankly, very few analysts, certainly the intelligence community, is very reticent to get into these types of discussions because they're very thorny, right? It's hard to calculate, it's hard to categorize risk in that way. But that really is the question that you need to ask. And the contention that I made was, look, the risk to the average American of being killed in a terrorist attack by the likes of Al-Qaeda today is negligibly small, right? Negligibly small. And if we withdraw from Afghanistan, the question is, how much would that risk go up? And I would argue it might go up some, but it might go up a negligible amount relative to the thousands of other things that Americans might care about that might kill them on a day in and day out basis. Pandemics being one, right? I mean, climate change being another. I mean, there's, cancer, et cetera. There are all these different things that you could point to. And the question is really, do you want to, do we want to continue paying $30 billion a year and, several thousand Afghan lives in order to prevent what is likely to be a relatively small increase in the threat of terrorism, to the average American? And those are the types of cost benefit analyses that I don't think people are in the headspace of because they're not asking the right questions.
Can I add, Adam, something to John's really excellent answer, which is that in addition to the issue of how much risk and costs are going up, the how much element, there is also the very important consideration of opportunity costs. John spoke about them in terms of taking $30 billion and not putting them to climate change prevention, pandemic prevention, responses to those issues. But they're also with respect to terrorist threat elsewhere. And I think the Biden administration has quite accurately emphasized that it is not obvious, I would perhaps go even stronger in the wording, that the threat of terrorism to US citizens, US assets today is anywhere greater from Afghanistan than it is from West Africa, than it is from East Africa. And as I have been highlighting in lots of my work, then it's domestic terrorism threat or domestic threat of violence from right-wing armed groups, in which, unfortunately, the stress and consequences of US military veterans are playing a role, the real difficulty of dealing with those wars. And we have seen this consistently after Vietnam, after World War II, and we see it around the world. There are consequences to being militarily deployed, even if the consequence is to a small percentage of soldiers and veterans. Some of them will really struggle and might join militancy. And we have seen the same increases in militancy after Vietnam, domestic militancy after World War II. And those are factors that need to be considered in the weighing of the terrorism issue also. And let alone the larger strategic costs of not being bogged down in a strategically insignificant place and neglecting the opportunity cost to US Special Operations Forces, US intelligence assets, ISR, vis-a-vis far more important strategic challenges such as China and Russia.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this withdrawal is happening amid the COVID crisis, because we really did see a pandemic in which, in terms of loss of US lives, we were seeing a 9/11 every week for week after week after week after week. And I think that puts things into perspective. I guess my next question for you, Vanda, is that you've been around the world focusing on non-state actors. A lot of folks in DC have really focused on one area, one geographical area, and I think the lessons of Afghanistan are oftentimes compartmentalized. They're placed in a silo, and you have seen what it means to interact with non-state actors in Latin America and Mexico and South Asia, all in the Middle East and East Africa, all around the world. And when we if we accept the position that it was the right decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, I think the next question we come to is, well, what comes next? And some of the questions in the chat have focused on how we can support diplomacy, how we can support women's rights. Do you have any lessons learned from your work all over the world about why diplomacy and responsible aid might be the right course of action rather than boots on the ground? And if it is the right course of action, maybe you could get into the nuts and bolts of how you actually go about it.
Sure. So let me reiterate the point that Rick also made right at the beginning, which is that the boots on the ground were not going to bring about a peace. The Taliban would not have negotiated. It made it very clear for decades, for the entire 20 years, and since we started having even secret negotiations with the Taliban, that the departure of US forces was absolute priority. I would also say, however, that the US military presence was also not incentivizing the Afghan government to negotiate either, or at least negotiating anything else other than what is a nice peace deal. I use the analogy of Colombia. What do I mean by that? Essentially a deal in which the Taliban would agree to disarm, go home to their villages, become farmers, perhaps get some DDR assistance, and some small role in the government, both at the national, provincial, and district level, allowed to run an election and not change the constitutional order. This is a great peace deal, but it's a peace deal called victory. And there is no prospect, in my view, to reach that kind of peace deal. And for the US to commit to embracing this peace deal would mean to be fighting with a much expanded force beyond some minimum counterterrorism force for a long time. Now, why do I preface my comments about what tools we have now? Because I am not under any illusion that regional diplomacy, US diplomacy, and economic shaping tools will accomplish this victory either. I don't think that we are going to arrive at this peace deal. In my view, the political and social dispensation will change. We will see reductions in liberties, in rights, and in pluralistic processes in Afghanistan. The question is how much we can minimize those losses, given that we are leaving, and how much we can minimize the amount of bloodshed before we get to some negotiated arrangements that has some chance of being stable. I also don't believe, however, that we can avoid some bloodshed. And I would say that, in my view, more potent in arriving to a less damaging deal is if Afghan special operations forces manage to stand for a year on their own. If they'll melt very rapidly, if we see very rapid disintegration, as the Taliban, in my view, will try for a significant military push in the fall and spring next year, then we will get a worse deal. Now, why do we have any hope of being able to shape the extent of losses, minimize the extent of losses through economic tools? Because the Taliban today is very aware that it does not want to lose US and Western aid. There's a lot of conversation, is the Taliban today the same as the Taliban in the 90s? We can go into that, but there is one important difference. In the 1990s, they wanted to ruin the country as institutional administrative structure and return to an existence like in the Muhammad's era. That was a purposeful plan. The leadership today doesn't want it, and even middle-level commanders don't want it. They don't want to see massive economic collapse in the country. That is a tool that helps us condition and shape their behavior, but at the margins. It's not going to make the Taliban democracy-embracing, civil rights-embracing, women-supporting actors.
Thanks for that answer. And I'm going to have a follow-up question in a couple minutes about how Congress can stay engaged in supporting development in Afghanistan. But first, I want to ask Jonathan a question about the ANDSF, because you wrote an article in Real Clear Defense that there are ways to remotely advise the ANDSF, and that the COVID era has actually prepared the US military for this role. So if you could briefly describe your main points in that article and how perhaps the United States can help the ANDSF continue to protect Afghans from terrorism and attacks without keeping boots on the ground.
Yeah, sure. I'll just note up front that the article was actually written by one of my analysts on my team named Alex Powell. I was a co-author to it, so I want to give him credit for having the lead pen on it. But it was an idea that he and I explored together, which stems out of the U.S. experience advising Afghan security forces over the last year during the era of COVID. And also, right, extends from some of the experience that U.S. forces had advising Iraq's counterterrorism service in its attempts to clear vast swaths of Mosul a few years back, in which they were already conducting remote advising of Iraqi security forces in that effort. And right, the realization is one where over the last year, again in Afghanistan, because of the COVID situation, the U.S. advisors had to go into an almost completely virtual stance, where they weren't allowed to leave their bases and go interact, face to face with their Afghan counterparts anymore. And so they had to figure out how to do things differently. And they used mediums like this, right? Zoom, Microsoft Teams, et cetera. They used WhatsApp, right? Various chat capabilities, direct messaging capabilities, right? And email, and lots of email, right? And is that as good as being face-to-face? No, of course it's not. But can you convey knowledge through this type of medium? Of course you can. We are doing that right now. And so when it comes down to, the situation of, okay, the US military is leaving physically from Afghanistan, does that mean that it has to completely throw up its hands and stop engaging with Afghan security forces going forward? No, it doesn't. And so we articulated, briefly a bunch of different ways that you could think about structuring such a cell, whether you put it in the continental United States, whether you put it at, for example, CENTCOM Forward headquarters in Qatar. You could put it in a regional country. There's different ways you could think about staffing it, depending on what capabilities you think need to be in there. And there's the possibility of, depending on how finely you want to parse terms in the U.S. Taliban agreement, we discussed an option whereby you could potentially, not deploy advisors to Afghanistan, but have them travel to Afghanistan, right, for brief periods of time, a week, 2 weeks at a time, to what the U.S. military calls advising at the point of need, right? So if there's some specific thing that they need to have, somebody come in and, hey, we've got a broken helicopter, we can't figure out how to fix it via Zoom, we need to have somebody put eyeballs on that. Okay, we fly somebody there for a week to help them fix that specific problem, and then that person or people fly back out. And you could also do the reverse of that, right? You could fly Afghan individuals, again, to wherever the advising cell is, and in what you would call fly to be advised approach, and continue to provide advice that way. So there are, I think, a number of creative, approaches that could be taken that fall between what I would argue the false dichotomy of you're there with 2,500 troops on the ground physically, or you're completely gone and you've thrown up your hands at the problem and never look back at it.
Okay, thanks for that. We have two questions in the chat that basically drive at what does strategic importance really even mean? And what does it mean in the context of Afghanistan? And one of the questions I think rightfully points out that we often just strictly focus on terrorism when it comes to Afghanistan. And frankly, that's true, I think, for Pakistan in a lot of ways, and perhaps also nuclear deterrence issues. And I want to direct this question at the ambassador, which is, you've spent a lot of time in Pakistan, you spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, you spent time in the Middle East, and you've seen this region up close, and you've also seen where it falls in the hierarchy of U.S. strategic interests. And interests in that region vary from terrorism to climate change to economic considerations to refugee flows. I could go on and on. In your view, Ambassador, what are the non-security U.S. strategic interests in Afghanistan and in Central and South Asia writ large?
Okay, well, first of all, non-security interests with regard to Afghanistan, they're actually, it has to be said that they are fairly minimal. There is no great trade between the United States and Afghanistan. As has already been noted, it's a landlocked country. and its primary exports, even in times of peace. The last times, Afghanistan was at peace was in the 1970s, were primarily, fruits and nuts and agricultural products. So, that's not a large element of the relationship. I would say there is a question of U.S. interest, at least as far as sort of global credibility. And here you will hear a lot of arguments about U.S. credibility being diminished by our decision to withdraw. I think here again, there's a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done, because there is also a cost to a prolonged investment that doesn't seem to be generating much return. And that's the question that many of our partners, especially in East Asia, would be asking. With regard to South Asia, and if you want to say the Indo-Pacific region, obviously our interests are much larger. We have huge trade issues, and we have much larger, I would say, security issues. And this is really where things have changed with regard to Afghanistan, as we've alluded to several times in this conversation, over the course of the past 5 years. The central element, I think everyone in Washington would agree, the central focus of traditional foreign policy and geopolitical concerns has to do with the rise of China, not just in security terms, but in economic terms. It is a country that is on track to supplant, if it is not already supplanted, the United States' role as the largest economy in the world, a position we have held since 1870, more or less. This is a much bigger challenge than we ever faced from the Soviet Union. And one of the reasons the Cold War playbook is probably not appropriate for dealing with China. So I think that, again, this comes to the question that Vonda raised at the outset. We have to be thinking in terms of opportunity costs and strategic prioritization. One thing that I would note, and maybe Jonathan would have some comments on this, is that while, at least according to the press reports, the leadership of the Department of Defense preferred to keep a residual presence in Afghanistan, it seems to me that in many ways the services are moving ahead with preparing for an entirely different approach. The Marines are giving up their tanks and thinking about holding islands in the South China Sea. The Navy SEALs are moving away from counterterrorism as their central defining mission and moving towards traditional maritime operations. So all of this is evidence that in some sense there is a strategic reprioritization taking place within U.S. thinking about the entire region.
Do you think there's, President Obama and President Biden, my mistake, President Biden and Secretary Blinken promised a more diplomacy-centered approach to foreign policy that wasn't centered on projection of U.S. force abroad. Do you think there's something to be said for gaining U.S. credibility by leading diplomatically rather than simply through the projection of military force or deterrence?
Well, look, I think there's a balance, and I think that it's a cliche, but obviously the United States needs to approach these issues on a whole of government basis and on a case-by-case basis. And there are going to be times where the projection of military force is going to be very important. But I don't think it should be the case that U.S. diplomacy always has to be conducted in the shadow of the use of military force. I don't think that's consistent with our values. But I also don't think, I think it's a little bit of a lazy approach. And I think that we have to be prepared to engage with the outside world and engage in diplomatic give and take. Diplomacy is necessarily a messy business, and it involves compromises. but it also can generate results that are, perhaps not as clear cut as a military victory, but the fact is we don't always get a military victory, and some problems are just not susceptible to military solutions.
Vanda, I want to recenter Afghanistan specifically for a moment in the few minutes we have left. And you spoke about how there is no military solution. Boots on the ground can't coerce Afghans into a peace deal that neither side might want, but that you do think that aid and diplomacy and development can have marginal benefits. And that's simply the universe that the Biden administration has to occupy, while recognizing that progress may be slow and it might not even be achieved at all, but that's where they can make a difference. I saw a question when I was advertising this panel on Twitter that I thought was interesting. Could the Afghan government be punished for achieving a peace deal with the Taliban that perhaps took, had some rights in Afghanistan take a step back? Because we know that a peace deal will require tough compromises. And certainly it's a privilege for all of us to be able to sit here in the United States and say that. And it's going to be Afghans who are going to face the consequences of that. But the alternative is open-ended conflict. But how do we deal with aid conditionality? How do we convince Congress that it's important to remain engaged and it's important to make aid conditional, but perhaps not make, or is there a risk that the perfect could be the enemy of the good when it comes to aid conditionality, where Congress withholds aid simply because some rights have taken a step back or because corruption levels remain high? How do you strike that balance of remaining engaged and having some conditionality and trying to influence or trying to encourage better behavior, but not just cutting Afghanistan completely loose?
Well, I am not so much concerned about the risk of corruption remaining high and conditions cutting of aid. Unfortunately, we have mostly not done that in 20 years. And one of the reasons why the Taliban is so entrenched is because governance has been, by and large, poor, predatory, rapacious, capricious, to the point that even predictable brutality by the Taliban might be easier for some local populations to live with than the capricious, rapacious, predatory governance. And so despite those problems and very large corruption and inadequate progress, aid has flown, often mostly unaffected. But I think there is a real dilemma about the following prospect: that if the Afghan Republic, its various members, key power brokers, did not splinter and made a deal with the Taliban that changes the order, that the United States and West European countries would cut off aid. I don't think that Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan and other actors would cut off aid. They are not concerned about those issues to the same extent that the United States is, and often operating very authoritarian, repressive regimes. And so we are in a kind of interesting position here. Of course, as part of the bargaining and part of the pressure on the Taliban, the posturing is very maximalist. No changes to those rights, no changes to the political order, or else we cut off your money. That might be appropriate as the first bit in the bargaining process, the international bargaining process with the Taliban and with other actors. In my view, if that stays being the only bargain that our Congress, our citizens, the parliaments in Europe are willing to make, then we risk the chance that should there be a peace deal, we will unravel the peace deal, we will pull the rug from under it, because in my view, the peace deal will not look that way. And so then we will need to have some very hard bargaining. What can we do in the meantime? Well, there is obligation on our part to inform our lawmakers, our government officials, with as much accurate analysis as one can do in projections about those possibilities and the costs and consequences. But I would say it's also equally important to educate the Taliban about what modern governing, modern interactions with the international system with donor agencies look like. The Taliban often have no idea. It was very interesting what happened after the fall donor conference that emphasized strict conditionality rights over and over. And then if you talk with the Taliban afterwards, they would say, it doesn't matter to us. It's a deal with the current government that we don't recognize in donors. When we are in power, we make our own deal. And one would have to tell the Taliban, well, it's not so simple. Western governments are not going to write checks without wanting to see how you are not oppressing women, how women are getting access to the money. And it took a whole set of subsequent conversations to even get the Taliban to say, oh, okay, what would it look like? So there, in my view, an important tool of shaping the Taliban is to be educating the Taliban, exposing it, what governance, modern governance entails, and what it entails vis-a-vis its own citizens, but also the international community.
Well, thanks for that answer. I guess if I could add my own thoughts, since we're at the end of this panel, I mean, I personally think that the withdrawal decision was correct, but this is going to be a real test for the Biden administration and for Congress to lead diplomatically and remain engaged even when U.S. troops are no longer on the ground. And with that, I'd like to thank the panelists for joining. And you know, these panels never last long enough. I think we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. Hopefully, we'll have additional panels that explore these topics. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Eli.
Thank you, Adam, for moderating this excellent discussion. And thank you, Ambassador Olson, Dr. Feldbaum-Brown, Dr. Schroden, for sharing your extensive insights with us today. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't urge all of you in the audience and those of us participating in the webinar to join us on Thursday, May 13th for our webinar entitled The End of Great Power Competition, at which we'll ask the questions, what are the US interests the great power competition aims to advance? What threats do China and Russia pose to the United States? And is great power competition capable of differentiating between the two? The webinar will be moderated by Quincy's Stephen Wertheim and feature Quincy's Michael Swain, Emma Ashford, and from the New American Engagement Initiative at the Scowcroft Center, and Elbridge Colby from the Marathon Initiative. You can find out all about it at Quincy's website, quincyinst.org, as well as about all of our other upcoming programming and our published works. Thank you all so much for attending, and to our panel for participating.